I think that the best way to start, I think, is by calling attention to the fact that in 2010, President Morsi called the Jews the sons of apes and pigs. And then somehow, for some reason, and I'm not sure why, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, it was treated like news in the United States. It got to the front page of the New York Times. It got to a lot of other major media. And the question that baffled me is, why now? Why all of a sudden this particular instance of outrageous anti-Semitism is getting some attention, whereas all of the other incidents that I have been certainly reading about and studying for quite a few years, and that everybody who even bothers to look a little bit could see, why that did not get much attention. And when it happened, I sort of wondered, well, maybe this time it's so public and it's so outrageous that we finally found an instance of anti-Semitism coming from the Muslim world, from a high place in the Muslim world, that would be impossible to ignore. That the left, that the academics, that the human rights community, they would have to seize upon this and pay attention to it. Perhaps when Morsi told his countrymen to nurse our children and our grandchildren on hatred for Jews and Zionists, he sounded an alarm for those who have so often tried to argue that we can find friends within the Muslim Brotherhood. And indeed, President Obama's spokesman said that he severely condemned Morsi's language, but he also reaffirmed the American commitment to the Egyptian president and his pro-peace role. One has to wonder a bit about a pro-peace role which is predicated upon a belief that you're going to nurture your children and your grandchildren on hatred. A pro-peace role which is based on that premise has to be a very complex or a very subtle pro-peace role. There's something about it that just doesn't seem right. Now, meanwhile, the New York Times wondered, without a shred of evidence, whether perhaps, and this is from a New York Times editorial, they wondered whether perhaps becoming president made Morsi, and this is a quote, think differently about the need to respect all people. And now if they said that on the basis of some evidence, some declaration that I was totally wrong in what I said previously, and now I see things differently, then I can understand that making it into an editorial in the most respected newspaper in the United States. But without a shred of evidence to say that, it makes you wonder what's going on. I guess that the editors are suggesting that he could be a new man. I guess what they're suggesting is, as Morsi did, that his comments were taken out of context. You don't have to think a long time to wonder what context justifies saying we will teach our children and our grandchildren to hate the Jews and the Zionists. What's the context that makes that right? But in any case, if we did believe that the comments were taken out of context and that Morsi had become a new man, we are still left neglecting the fact that this sort of anti-Semitism is endemic throughout many parts of the Muslim world. So Morsi's comments, to get back to them, why were they news? Isn't this, and that sometimes you actually hear that used against you when you're trying to bring attention to this problem. I sometimes hear the first line of argument is, well, it's not really a problem, it's not really anti-Semitism. And then, when you convince them that it is, then they tell you, well, everybody knows that there's this anti-Semitism, so it's not news. So I'm finding that it cuts both ways. You have, on the one hand, people telling you that it doesn't exist. Then once you convince them that it exists, they say, well, we shouldn't talk about it because it's not news. And I think that what this indicates to me is that somehow there is a real unwillingness in the West to discuss all of this. And that I think that when I use the word conspiracy, I'm not using it in the sense of a secret conspiracy where people get together and say, let's not talk about this. What I think it is much more subtle. I think that part of the problem is that the human rights community, Middle East studies professors, social scientists, even governments have been reluctant to criticize Muslims on this issue because the West is trying so hard to get along with the world of Islam and trying to broker an elusive Arab-Israeli peace deal. And there's somehow a belief that by calling too much attention to this issue, it's going to get in the way of building bridges. It's going to get in the way of building bridges. I ran into this with Noni Darwish, who is an Arab woman, an Egyptian, and that when I don't know how well known she is, but she was the daughter of a martyr for Islam, or someone considered a martyr, who had been killed by the Israelis. And so when she grew up, she was given special honors in Egypt as the daughter of a martyr, and she was treated, she and her family were treated fairly well by the Egyptian regime. But as she grew up, she became very dissatisfied, firstly, with the way women were treated. And then secondly, along the way, she started to think that, that Israel perhaps was not so terrible. So anyway, she moved to the United States. She ended up converting to Christianity, forming a group called Arabs for Israel, and writing a book called Now They Call Me Infidel, talking about how she had once been called this honored daughter of a martyr, but now she's called an infidel. And in there, arguing, among other things, that there's a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism in the Muslim world. So a number of Jewish groups tried to invite her to their college campus. She was invited to Columbia to speak, she was invited to BU, she was invited to Princeton. But they didn't all work out, these invitations. What happened with the Princeton invitation is that as soon as she was invited and it was published, she was invited by a group called Tigers for Israel, and by, I guess, a Jewish Hillel group, and then she was also invited by another organization which sponsored bringing people with unpopular viewpoints to campus. But then the rabbi, who was the head of the Hillel at Princeton, got a phone call from the imam, who was the head of the Muslim Students Organization. I may have some of the titles slightly off. And he said that she was considered hostile to Islam, and that if she came to Princeton, Muslim students were going to protest, and that they would take this as an unfriendly act on the part of the Jewish students' organizations bringing her there. So she said that she wasn't going to tell her group what to do, but she was sympathetic to the argument, and she said she had a very good working relationship with the imam, and she had been trying very, very hard to build bridges with the Muslim community, and she didn't want to do anything that was going to jeopardize that. So she had a meeting with her board, and everybody except for the one person who had initially come up with the idea of inviting her, they all decided we better withdraw the invitation. So they withdrew the invitation, and she was told that that the Jewish groups don't want to invite her anymore. So as soon as the Jewish groups decided they didn't want to invite her anymore, then what happened was that the group that was going to sponsor unpopular viewpoints on campus, they decided, well, we don't want to invite her either anymore. And then what happened is that the Republican student organization said, well, we want to bring her. And then what happened is that Princeton told them they didn't have time to arrange security. And so she was uninvited. Now, something fairly similar happened at Columbia. Now, I don't have an insider account on any of this. I'm working off of published accounts here, and I talked to a few people. But the situation at Columbia was, again, that she was told by the administration that they didn't have enough lead time to arrange security for her. So she had already come across the country, and she was from California to New York, and they couldn't meet at Columbia, so she had to take her group and go meet at a restaurant, uptown. And so that's where her meeting took place there. Now, when she spoke at BU, she actually was allowed to speak, but as a protest, there was a fire in the bathroom. And, and at least it was described by some as a protest associated with the event. So she is pretty much regarded, certainly by the left, as persona non grata. Now, I might add that her second book, where she talks about Islam, she is very critical of the religion. And she is not just critical of radical Islam, she's critical of Islam as a religion. She's not, in my view, racist or bigoted. She's being critical of it in the same way that a convert out of a religion, someone leaving Judaism, someone leaving Christianity, who wants to make their arguments about what they found unsatisfactory about the religion. So, that's part of it there. Now, I'm running out of time. I want to make a couple more points. One is, why does all this matter? Why does Muslim anti-Semitism matter? Obviously, this is a reasonably small crowd. This is not something that most Americans feel particularly engaged by this issue. And the body count is pretty low by 20th century standards so far. We have Daniel Pearl, the Chabad Center in Mumbai, I would count, the plot against the synagogues in the Bronx, the attack on the Jewish Federation building in Seattle. There's a guy, Warren Weinstein, who went over to help Pakistan with its economic development, and he was kidnapped. And as far as I know, he hasn't been released. They kidnapped him because they sent a message out, we've got the Jew. But anyway, so there is a body count, but it's a relatively low one. One thing to keep in mind is that when this anti-Semitism exists, it is not first and foremost, or not even only, real Jews that they're talking about. The belief of the anti-Semites is that America is in the hands of the Jews. And so you find that anti-Americanism is a very close cousin of anti-Semitism. It always has been. It was with the Nazis. It was with the Soviet Union. It almost always is a pretty close cousin of anti-Americanism. And so you find a guy who attacked Fort Dix, for example. He said, well, my first choice was to kill some Jews. My second choice is Fort Dix. And then you have many non-Jews who are thought to be Jews. So David Letterman, for example, received threats because he was a Jew, which he wasn't. And when Lara Logan was sexually abused in Cairo by a large crowd, they screamed beforehand, "Get her, she's a Jew." And you even see Walt Disney, who I've read arguments, is he or isn't he an anti-Semite? Was he or wasn't he an anti-Semite? But he's regarded in many circles as a Jew. Much of the U.S. government, you see all sorts of government officials, they say the Jew this guy, the Jew this guy, and the guy is not Jewish. So that what we're talking about here is a complex of hatred that extends to Americans, it extends to non-Jews, and it's important to keep in mind that there never has been an anti-Semitic movement that was otherwise progressive. Okay, the one thing you never ever see happen is this guy's an anti-Semite, but except for that, he's kind of reasonable. Okay, it doesn't happen. And so anti-Semitism in this sense can be viewed as a canary in a coal mine. You see that phrase all the time in books on anti-Semitism. It's a sign that something broader is wrong with the polity. The other thing is, it is certainly a sign that there's something wrong with the anti-racist community. If you look at all the people who study all the textbooks on prejudice and discrimination, they don't even mention the issue. It's not even mentioned. I did a search of the social science literature for studies that deal with Muslim anti-Semitism. I did it back in 2003. There was almost nothing. Since then, I've found maybe a handful of articles, a few books, but the community of social psychologists that was so important in combating anti-black racism, so important in combating so many other forms of racism. The social scientists, and I pride myself as coming from this community of social psychologists, they have nothing to say about this. There was one article that was published, and there's one research team with Lee Jussum and Floret Cohn operating out of Rutgers and College of Staten Island. It's done a couple of articles. There's very, very little of this type of research which is being done. The Middle East studies professors, they don't want to hear about it. They are apologizing left and right for the anti-Semitism and apologizing left and right for Islamism and other forms of extremism. And then in addition to that, the human rights community. You find that the organizations that ought to be taking a lead, you have the Jewish organizations, some of which are doing a good job. The Anti-Defamation League is doing a good job with this. There are Jewish organizations which are doing it, but the general anti-racism, anti-prejudice organizations don't want to hear about this. Now, I might look at some, very, very briefly, just enumerate some of the counter-arguments. I won't have time to address them, but I want to list what they are and tell, in a word, what I think is wrong. One argument you hear all the time, and this is a very simplistic one, is Arabs can't be anti-Semites because they're Semites. And then what this is simply a semantics game. Anti-Semitism, when it was formulated, was basically, it was in the 1870s when Wilhelm Marr coined the term. He was basically using it because he wasn't Christian, but he hated Jews. And so he wanted a pseudoscientific, well, he wanted a scientific basis. It turned out to be a pseudoscientific basis for his anti-Jewish racism. There never has been a movement which has targeted Jews and other Semites. But in any case, change the name if you want. Call it Jew hatred, and then that argument goes away. Another argument is Muslims don't hate Jews, they hate Zionists and or Israelis. And here, if you look at the actual content of the anti-Semitic statements, you will see that the references are to the evil in the Talmud, the evil in the Jewish Bible, the evils that existed way before the Zionists even came onto the stage, and they see Zionism as a consequence of the nefarious Jewish character. Another argument is all criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism. The answer here is of course not. Criticism of Israel is a perfectly legitimate type of political criticism when it doesn't cross the line into anti-Semitism. Okay? But that doesn't mean that just because you are also criticizing Israel, you are free from being charged as an anti-Semite. Another argument you get is there's a little unavoidable spillover from the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's unavoidable. That because of the war, you're going to get this sort of thing. And I think that just disregards the whole history of what went before, if you think it's just coming out of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Another one, how would you expect people to react to all those Israeli transgressions? Well, here you have to refute this, you have to get into an argument about whether the Israeli transgressions somehow were of such an order as to merit the level of hostility and hatred that you see, and just what were these transgressions. So there's not a quick answer to this, but there's an answer because, first of all, even if those transgressions existed, it doesn't justify anti-Semitism. The argument that Islam has always provided historically provided a welcoming home for Jews. Well, Jews historically were considered dhimmis, or second-class citizens, and that they had to follow all sorts of rules that were discriminatory, and that this is just a misreading of history. Another one is to say it's historically inaccurate to say that Islam, the religion, contains the seeds of Jew hatred. Well, if you're going to argue that this is historically inaccurate, then you certainly have to make that argument, and the way Tarek Fatah is, and you have to go through all the seemingly anti-Semitic statements and show how they're not really anti-Semitic. And I don't see that happening very much. The real propagators of serious anti-Semitism are Christians, and the right wing in the United States. Well, there certainly is very serious anti-Semitism coming from the militia movement, the extreme right. They talk all the time about ZOG, the Zionist-occupied government. Those guys are pretty bad, but I think that on the basis of the evidence, you would have to say that the larger threat is the threat coming from Islamic anti-Semitism, and it's not an either-or proposition in any case. That I'm painting with too broad a brush. And here I'm arguing that I'm not painting with too broad a brush. I am totally on the same page as liberal Muslims, as truly liberal Muslims. Bassam Tibi, I may disagree with him occasionally with some of his views about Israel. Tarek Fatah, I sometimes disagree with some of his views about Israel here and there. But basically, these are guys who see more or less eye to eye to, Khalil Muhammad at San Diego State and Irshad Manji. They're not mainstream figures in Islamic theology, but they are people who consider themselves believing Muslims, and they have come up with essentially similar conclusions. Another one is nice people don't criticize other people's religious beliefs. Well, this is tricky because I'm not by nature someone who likes to criticize other people's religious beliefs, and I think we're better off in a world where we give everybody a lot of room for their religious beliefs. But on the other hand, when religious beliefs are used to justify hatred, then you can't criticize the hatred without also criticizing the religious beliefs. Nobody would argue that Jews did not have a right to criticize Christian theology when it was anti-Semitic. And another argument is, well, shouldn't we be talking about Islamophobia in the United States? And I think that in many ways we should. I believe that Islamophobia I think that word is not a good word because it implies fear, but I think that bigotry against Muslims does exist in the United States. And I think that if I were do I think in the United States that I experience a warmer reception as a Jew than a typical Muslim does? I think the answer is that I do. And I think that if there's policing to be done in our own home, if there's improvements, if there's a battle against that type of bigotry, then I think that we have to be a part of that too. But that doesn't negate the fact that this other issue is out there. Criticisms of Islamic anti-Semitism are Islamophobic. Well, I think that is ridiculous. Where the anti-Semitism is coming from is where you have to criticize it. And that aren't Jews just as bigoted against Muslims? And here, I think, if you actually look at the evidence, you will find that Jews do not score as more bigoted than other Americans or Westerners against Muslims. They actually have, on most forms of tolerance, Jews score higher. I have seen one survey in New York City. When you're comparing Jews to other New Yorkers, who are, of course, a very liberal community, the Jews slightly scored more anti-Muslim. But that was by like 1 or 2 percentage points, and it's comparing Jews to other liberals in New York. But everywhere else where you do these studies, you find that Jews score as more tolerant and as, I'll take just 2 more minutes. Then the one other one is it's not in the best interest of interfaith cooperation. If we want to have good interfaith relations, we should talk about what we agree about. Well, I think there's an elephant in the room. I think that you can't leave this out of that discussion. And I think real interfaith, it might mean accepting that other people aren't perfect. And it might mean forgiving people for past anti-Semitism, but it doesn't mean tolerating present anti-Semitism or ignoring it. It's not in the best interest of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Well, here I think a lot of the problem, a lot of the reason that we have this conflict going on is because the Muslim world had great difficulty tolerating the Jews' emergence from dhimmi status. The Jews were treated reasonably well as long as they stayed in a subordinate role. But when Jews emerged as an independent nation, that contradicted some of the deepest beliefs of Muslims, because in the Muslim world, the reason there was not so much hostility against Jews as there was in Christianity is the Muslims believed that they had already defeated the Jews in the 7th century, that Muhammad had put that issue to rest. Jews were weak, and Jews couldn't defend themselves, and Islam had triumphed. And once they triumphed, there was occasionally room for magnanimity, but the Jews had to stay in their designated role. And I think that when Jews emerged from that designated role into independent statehood and when they then started winning wars, it was just too much to bear, and I think that that fueled some of this anti-Semitism. So anyway, I think it's the whole thing, just to summarize, if you're asking me what can be done, I don't have a good answer. And I do think this is a litmus test for the West. I think it's a litmus test for the left. I think it's a litmus test for the right, for the government, for human rights organizations, for the UN, for Europe. Remember, there's never been a movement that was anti-Semitic but otherwise reasonable. And so it's a challenge not only to Jews, but to all Americans.